For the year 2018, over 16 billion gallons of ethanol is supposed to be produced. At least that is what an online article titled U.S. Fuel Ethanol Production Capacity Continues to Increase from the U.S. Energy Information Administration calculated. Ethanol is one of the alternative fuel sources that slows the use of non-renewable sources of fuel. I will be talking about the history of ethanol, how it is produced, and how it is used. Next, I'll be talking about the positives and negatives of it, then the environmental effects. Finally, I'll be talking about the future of ethanol. The first thing I want to talk about is the production, history, and use of ethanol. The history of ethanol. The author Cole Gustafson wrote an online article titled History of Ethanol Production and Policy, published in March 2010, which adds ethanol saw its first use in 1826 to power an engine. Later in his article, Gustafson lists other inventions in which ethanol was used in. For instance, it was used in Nicholas Otto's four-cycle engine, Henry Ford's Model T, and it was also used in World War II because of fuel shortages. Gustafson also states that the modern-day ethanol industry began in the 1970s when petroleum-based fuel prices became expensive. Ethanol production and use today. Ethanol is a grain alcohol that can be used as fuel. An online article titled Ethanol from the University of Illinois Extension, published in 2018, specifies that about 70% of today's ethanol is blended with some amount of today's gasoline is blended with some amount of ethanol in the U.S. There are two types of ethanol, E10 and E85. E10 is 10% ethanol and 90% gasoline. Use of it is common enough that it's covered under warranty by all car manufacturers in the U.S. The author Dennis Pennington, a researcher from Michigan State University, wrote an online article titled Burning E85 in Your Vehicle, published in October 2014, which states running your vehicle on E85 can produce 19 to 51% less greenhouse emissions depending on the way that is produced. E85 is 85% ethanol and 15% gasoline. As previously mentioned article from the University of Illinois Extension established, most ethanol is produced from corn. The production of corn ethanol begins with the corn being ground up finely and then mixed with water, heated, and then it cools and ferments, and then it is again reheated and the vapor cools in the ethanol. Ethanol is made at a plant like this. Now let's talk about the positives and negatives of ethanol. The positives. The online article titled Ethanol Economic Gain or Drain, published July 2008 and written by Kevin L. Cleanston, a business economist and researcher at Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, and by Joshua A. Burge, a former research analyst, argues ethanol makes these three positives: a small dent in the U.S.'s need to import oil, 2, cheaper fuel prices, meaning more money can be spent on other items, and 3, ethanol production supports agriculture, meaning more money for farmers. Now for ethanol negatives. According to an online article titled Fuel Ethanol, a Hero or Villain, claims ethanol has these three negatives: less fuel energy, meaning less miles per gallon; 2, ethanol is water soluble, meaning it is more likely to pick up contaminants that could get into your engine; and 3, ethanol makes more competition among crops. Now let's take a look at the environmental effects of ethanol. Environmental effects of spilled ethanol. According to an online article titled Effects of Ethanol-Based Fuel Contamination from the American Chemical Society, concludes these three changes. 1, stimulated organism growth; 2, explosive amounts of methane in the air; and 3, it could temporarily change an ecosystem. Environmental effects of ethanol production. As previously stated, article from the University of Illinois Extension explains that ethanol production takes a great amount of energy, and to produce 1 gallon of ethanol it takes 3 gallons of water. Finally, let's take a look at ethanol's future. The online article titled Increasing Efficiency, Reducing Emissions with Hydrogenous Ethanol in Diesel Engines by the Center of Transportation Studies from the University of Minnesota presents a different type of ethanol, hydrogenous ethanol, a more watery type of ethanol than traditional ethanol. It is 75% ethanol and 25% water. It produces less emissions than normal ethanol, but it is still being heavily researched. As previously mentioned, article from the University of Illinois Extension introduces another type of ethanol called cellulosic ethanol, which is ethanol produced from the starches and sugars of a broken down plant cell wall. To break down a plant cell wall is not an easy task nor cheap. It is very expensive, but researchers hope to be able to produce cellulosic ethanol cheaply within 10 years. In conclusion, ethanol is one of the alternative fuel sources that slows the use of non-renewable sources of fuel. Today we learned about the history of ethanol, how it is produced, how it is used, the positives and negatives of it, the environmental effects of it, and the future it has. With how much people rely on fuel, it is nice to see that new fuels are being researched and used.